this workshop / talk is intended to provide an introduction for people who are new to abolition, but also hopefully something for folks who are a little bit familiar with it. The talk itself is about 50 minutes, and then after that we'll have like 30-40 minutes for Q&A, but hopefully more discussion. I'm really wanting to stimulate a conversation for us to have here rather than you guys just asking me questions, but you're welcome to do that, of course. I want to give a caveat that I'm not a person of color. I'm not formally incarcerated. I come from a position of privilege. I'm a full-time academic, part-time activist. So the information I'm going to give you today comes from a certain limited perspective, but I do draw from the work of activist organizations, people involved in the movement, and my own experiences in movement work in addition to academic sources. But please, if there's anything that I say here that you disagree with or feel like you need a challenge or question, please by all means do. I'm still learning, and I want to constantly be revising my conceptions of what I think is right, especially with regard to this kind of material. Even since I prepared this presentation, I learned all kinds of things that made me want to change some of the things that I put in here. My work that I'm going to be talking a bit about today focuses on abolitionist analyses of contemporary reforms, especially quote unquote rehabilitation and reentry. So that is some of what you guys are going to get here today. So what I want to start off with is why not reform? So reform has been a hot topic for a few years now, especially since the right has jumped on the reduce incarceration bandwagon. There's been a shift over the last decade in the tone of criminal punishment rhetoric from tough on crime to one that's less overtly punitive anyway. And as part of this shift, we've seen more and more reforms, things like rehabilitation and reentry programs, shorter sentences, diversion programs, reinstating the franchise for formerly incarcerated people in some areas, ban the box campaigns. But there are a lot of people who argue that these kinds of reforms are explicitly not instances of curtailing the reach of the carceral state, and in fact that they're extensions of it, because they cast the carceral net beyond even the 7 million people who are currently under correctional supervision into the communities that the vast majority of these people come from through surveillance, control, and police occupation. Most of them are based on some really problematic assumptions, like the idea that problems like recidivism or police bias are fixable with policies that only address those particular issues without confronting deeper systemic ones like white supremacy, economic deprivation, or a lack of access to healthcare. And most of the reforms that we've seen over the last 10 years don't shift power, control, and resources out of the punishment system. They keep it in the hands of the same institutions and actors that create and sustain the carceral state. And in some cases, they actually give it more power, like projects that propose to improve mental health conditions in jails by constructing specialized carceral facilities to house mentally ill people, or increasing budget allocation to police departments for body cams and implicit bias training, some things that we've seen a lot of lately. And the effect of these particular kind of reforms is to expand the punishment bureaucracy, not to shrink it. And definitely not to transfer power and resources to communities that need them. They don't contribute to building a sustainable infrastructure that keep people out of prison to begin with. This is all part of a sort of liberal reform narrative about law's ability to do the right thing and to trend toward progress. It's a mythology that the system is fundamentally right and good and capable of achieving justice. It's just that it's kind of gone wrong in some areas. It assumes that the violence and systemic bias and institutional dysfunction of carceral systems are deviations and errors instead of fundamental and systemic features of those systems. It also assumes that surface level and piecemeal rearrangements of state infrastructure will be able to fix what's wrong with them. And this produces reforms that legitimate and strengthen the carceral state and ultimately serve to reproduce mechanisms of violence and oppression. And in this sense, These types of reforms are superficial and deceptive. They divorce crime problems from their structural roots, and they distract from the notion that the structure itself is inherently sick. So much of what reformists claim is wrong with the punishment system, so things like high rates of recidivism, racial disparities, they're intrinsic to the logic of how it's intended to work. In other words, these are features rather than bugs of the system. It's really inherently stacked against the interests of the poor, minorities, and marginalized groups. And even under ideal circumstances, the systems that we have now, from an abolitionist perspective, cannot be just, fair, or humane. So attempts to address the current problems that are making the assumption that the systems in place are appropriate starting points that need to just be improved is not going to cut it, and we need something different. So enter abolition. What is abolition? It's been described as a vision, a strategy, a plan for action, as well as a long-term goal. But it's also a life path and a set of values, and I'll talk more about this towards the end. The goal of abolition on a structural level is to eliminate carceral institutions and the prison industrial complex as a whole, and to replace them with non-punitive ways of addressing harm. Ones that empower rather than disenfranchise impacted populations and communities. And the project of abolition is contextualized by most abolitionists as part of a longer struggle against colonialism, enslavement, and white supremacy, as one of rebellion and resistance, and abolition as a next step in that larger project. And a rejection of the idea that the primary purpose of the punishment system is public safety. Understanding instead that it exists to sustain and serve the interests of imperialist racial capitalism. There's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding about what abolition is. It's well captured in this quote by a couple of scholars named Michelle Brown and Judah Sept. Ava, do you want to read that for us?
Sure. In the popular imagination of Americans, abolition seems an impossible vista of a world free of prisons, one that allows for harm, violence, and impunity to continue.
Awesome, thank you. The image that tends to come to mind for most people is one of breaking down prison walls, flinging open the gates, and the quote-unquote criminals sort of flooding out into the street and destroying things and creating violence and chaos. This is not what abolitionists envision. It's not what we are working for. Abolitionists are trying to render punishing institutions obsolete and to recreate justice according to totally different conceptions of what justice means. And above all, abolitionists are looking to transform the conditions that enable things like violence and harm and injustice to exist in the first place. And as Critical Resistance, a fantastic abolitionist organization, puts in their toolkit, Isaac, do you want to read that for us?
If we're imagining that a world without prisons is going to look like the world we live in now, we aren't really imagining abolition.
Thank you very much. Abolitionists demand a lot more than surface level reforms, and instead are committed to reimagining possibilities for society by aiming to shift power into impacted communities and fundamentally transforming the relationship between state, market, and society. The abolitionist perspective is rigorously reflective about the connections between reform and carceral expansion and the tendency of the punishment system to co-opt critique, because abolitionism refuses to view the prison as an isolated institution. The prison is a strategic site of critique for an abolitionist analysis because it's a place where state violence and its contradictions are concentrated and quite easy to see. So in this sense, it's sort of a doorway to understanding how it's really essentially the whole world that needs to transform if we're going to get actual justice. And abolition requires much more than the elimination of carceral institutions. It requires dismantling the institutional and social context in which prisons have come to be so deeply intertwined with the economy and thought of as an acceptable way to deal with social problems. And a couple of scholars named Moten and Harney describe the project of abolition as follows. Rose, do you want to read that for us?
Sure. Not so much the abolition of prisons, but the abolition of a society that could have prisons, that could have slavery, that could have the wage, and therefore not abolition as the elimination of anything, but abolition as the founding of a new society.
Thank you very much. So it requires a radical restructuring of society and redistribution of resources, and a fundamental transformation in the societal response to quote unquote crime, and in the popular understanding of things like crime and justice. It also requires a radical transformation in the ways that we relate to one another. And again, I'll say more about this a little bit further on. It's really important to understand abolition not just as a project of tearing down and dismantling, but also as one of generating, of building and creating. And this idea is reiterated over and over again in contemporary abolitionist work, but it comes from W.E.B. Du Bois and Angela Davis's analysis of his work. She notes that abolition has to involve a process of reimagining institutions, ideas, and strategies and creating new ones. Du Bois argued that true abolition of slavery required a two-part process: a negative project of eliminating the practice of slavery, and a positive one, the creation of new institutions to provide Black people and oppressed people generally the economic and social resources needed to truly become a part of the social order. And Du Bois argued that slavery abolition was accomplished only in this negative sense. And because a positive project didn't take place, Black people encountered other forms of slavery, from debt peonage and the convict leasing system to segregated education. And Davis argues that this is why we have the punishment infrastructure that we have today. Mumia Abu-Jamal said that abolitionists are those beings who look out upon their time and say no. And in contrast, critical resistance, to quote them once again, talks about abolition as a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. So it's a particular way of thinking and seeing that isn't just about the no, but also about the yes, and that's the yes to the possibility of a different world. I'm going to say a couple of things relatively briefly about the history of abolition. So abolitionists tend to locate their work in different historical legacies. Some locate it in the legacy of the project of abolishing oppressive racist institutions that are the United States' history, so things like slavery, lynching, segregation, prisons. And they talk about abolition as having its roots in the abolitionist movement of the late 1700s. And I like to call this the new Jim Crow narrative based on Michelle Alexander's book. Others tend to situate the abolitionist project in a broader context of emancipatory struggle against oppression and exploitation much more broadly. So situating it in the tradition of resistance against colonialism, enslavement, and injustice from all periods of history across the globe, thinking of abolition as a continuation of emancipatory projects that have been going on for really as long as these things have been there to fight against. But most abolitionists and organizations claim both of these. One example of this is the Abolitionist Collective, and this quote I'm about to throw up here is from their manifesto. Mark Joseph, would you like to read that?
Sure. Many abolitionists situate their work in both. For example, the Abolition Collective, quote, "We draw inspiration from those who have sought the abolition of all systems of domination, exploitation, patriarchy, and oppression, from Jim Crow to prisons, from Jim Crow and prisons to patriarchy and capitalism. We also refer to all revolutionary movements insofar as they have abolitionist elements, whether the abolition of patriarchy, capitalism, heteronormativity, ableism, colonialism, the state, or white supremacy."
Wonderful, thank you so much. Okay, so now the next portion of this, I'm going to talk about some of the major debates in contemporary abolition. So first one of these, abolitionists usually distinguish between reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms. It's a little bit of a mouthful. This terminology comes from the writer named GORZ, who wrote in 1967. So reformist reforms are attempts to make palliative improvements to the system we have now that ultimately reinforce it, like some of the types of reforms I talked about in the very beginning. And non-reformist reforms or abolitionist reforms have as their end goal the eventual dismantling of the punishment system. And they're understood to be incremental steps in a larger strategy of societal transformation that steal some of the prison industrial complex's power, make it more difficult for it to function in the future. Reformist reforms are dedicated to working within the current structure, and so they tend to predefine the scope of crime problems as criminal punishment problems instead of understanding them as part of a larger context. And the abolitionist critique of reformist reforms is that they try to improve forms of abuse or dysfunction in the criminal process. And a non-reformist approach would understand, for instance, that efforts to eradicate poverty, capitalism, militarization, war, and white supremacy are decarceration and crime reduction strategies because these things directly contribute to problems of crime and violence and incarceration. And in this sense, the goal of closing prisons is only one leg of an abolitionist strategy, because an abolitionist approach to reform entails a holistic engagement with the root causes and structural conditions of suffering and injustice. In addition to some of the ones I mentioned earlier, a few examples of reformist reforms are projects to replace dilapidated old prisons with new, more quote-unquote humane ones. We've seen the construction of what have been called gender-responsive facilities that are intended to accommodate the needs of women and mothers. These are instances of what some abolitionists like to call carceral humanism. And the problem is that these kinds of proposed changes are still based on the assumption that social problems can be solved through carceral means. And ultimately, they give rise to the same outcome, which is demands and plans to build more prisons. Power stays in the hands of the state rather than the people. Electronic monitoring is another example. It's sometimes touted as a progressive alternative to incarceration that gives people the privilege of serving their time at home with their families. But the ultimate result is that it extends the reach and control of the carceral state literally into homes and communities. So effectively transforming people's homes into carceral institutions. And sometimes people are forced to pay for this privilege of their own home confinement. Some reformist reforms are state co-optations of abolitionist ideas. Restorative justice is one example of that. It's been made into part of the carceral machinery in some places by being incorporated into prisons and courts. And this situates it in an institutional context that conflicts with the foundational philosophy of restorative justice, which is about addressing harm and repairing relationships rather than punishing. It's probably better than some alternatives, but if it's couched in a punitive institution like this, it's not going to have the transformational effect that it's supposed to. And in addition to this, its roots are in indigenous practices. So using it in punishing institutions like this is essentially a form of colonialism. The system also co-opts critiques that abolitionists or anti-prison advocates have made of the system. So one example of this is abolitionists have pointed out that the majority of people in jails have mental health issues. And jails are totally inappropriate places to address these. In fact, they usually make mental health issues much worse. So the critique is that we need to decarcerate and heal people in community so that prisons don't have to function as these sort of neoliberal gatekeepers of social services. And that critique started to make its way into the mainstream. It started to make sense to people. And as this happened, we began to see this new concept of a mental health jail. And we've been seeing them crop up in a number of cities. Orange County is actually one of them. And if you're not already involved with or aware of Transforming Justice Orange County's Stop Construction of Music project, then definitely check that out. And if you don't know about it, I'd be happy to answer. Any of us from TGSU would be happy to answer questions afterward. Another sort of major debate is about the tension between long-term abolitionist goals, so a commitment to abolitionist principles on the one hand, and addressing the immediate material and sometimes life or death needs of people inside on the other hand. And some abolitionists argue that any sort of work to improve prison conditions contributes to their longevity and shouldn't be considered abolitionist, because it extends the life or the scope of the prison industrial complex and works against the long-term goal of eliminating the system. But there are urgent and sometimes literally life or death needs of those inside the walls related to things like healthcare, food, conditions of confinement, COVID. And in response to that, we've seen things like campaigns to improve conditions of incarceration or soliciting donations for commissary needs during the COVID kitchen lockdown because people are being given only rotten bologna sandwiches to eat. But these are not done, they're not carried out by people without a sense of conflict, because ultimately a lot of these just end up putting more funds and resources into the jails. And how we reconcile these things with abolitionist goals is a question that is constantly on the table. And to address this, I want to suggest some terminology. So a distinction between what I'm going to call downstream and upstream abolition work. And the downstream upstream language comes from a parable that's sometimes attributed to Saul Alinsky. Does anybody know the parable that I'm talking about? If you do, you can unmute yourself and say something about it.
So I can share if no one else is
it.
familiar with this. I think the story of the parable goes that people kept seeing, someone struggling and drowning at in the water at the base of the river, and so they kept jumping in, trying to save the people who were already drowning at the end of the river. And at some point, it's like, why don't we go up the river and figure out why people keep falling in and are drowning, instead of spending our effort trying to fix them once they're in? That's kind of my very generic interpretation of it.
That's perfect, Christy. Thank you. So yeah, the parable's been used to talk about social justice efforts and to kind of highlight the difference between addressing the symptoms of social problems versus addressing the root causes, just like Christy explained. And it's essential to deal with root causes, which for abolitionists means eliminating the prison industrial complex and the conditions of its existence. But in the meantime, people continue to suffer sometimes lethal violence that's brought upon them by the carceral state in ways that really require immediate attention. And these are issues that it's possible to address right now, if only to provide short-term relief that improves people's life conditions. And these kinds of approaches don't need to be incompatible with an abolitionist vision if they're guided by abolitionist values and principles. So we can talk about downstream abolition work, so work that addresses urgent needs, undertaken in a way that does not validate, strengthen, or contribute to expanding the life or the scope of the prison industrial complex, and at the same time maintaining a commitment to an abolitionist vision and guided by abolitionist principles. And upstream abolition work focuses on longer term goals that bring us closer to a society without a carceral state, including emancipatory and generative work that builds alternatives and empowers impacted people and communities. And on a practical level, abolitionists usually recognize that these things have to coexist. Here's an example from a fantastic organization called Black and Pink, which is an abolitionist organization with a focus on LGBTQ+ support. Daisy Chavez, do you want to read this for us?
I would love to. Let me just get my reading voice together. While we remain committed to the abolition of prisons, we recognize that meeting the needs and ending the daily sufferings of prisoners is also an urgent necessity. We are convinced that such reforms are not necessarily incompatible with an abolitionist politics, provided that they do not create new barriers or prisons that we will need to tear down in the future. Hence, our recommendation include policy proposals advocacy areas, and grassroots organizing priorities that meet the immediate needs of prisoners and criminalized LGBTQ communities outside of prison, which we believe will neither ideologically nor material increase the power of the PIC.
Thank you very much. So organizations definitely recognize this and on a practical level have been able to accommodate it. But at the same time, there's still the question, how do we do downstream work without actually contributing to the prison industrial complex? And you know, I'm not going to try to answer all these questions today. I will just point out that conflict is a part of this work, and sometimes we just need to let that exist and sort of work through these problems at the same time as we're trying to figure out our theories for how to address them. So I'm going to offer some criteria for identifying abolitionist reforms, and these come from abolitionist work in organizations and from talking about these questions among fellow organizers and impacted people. So most reformist reforms are going to try to address punishment system problems from within the system itself by trying to improve that system. And most of them are going to try to address crime by targeting individual people. So trying to tackle problems like substance abuse and recidivism without questioning how these problems developed in the first place by quote unquote targeting individual quote unquote offenders. And one example is something like barriers to success in reentry being framed as coming from individuals and their poor impulse control or anger problems or drug problems rather than talking about them as societal problems. Abolitionist reforms, on the other hand, operate from a value base that challenges carceral ideology, things like transformative justice, community accountability, and wellness approaches. They work to empower impacted people and build power and self-determination in those communities. They transfer resources out of the carceral state into impacted communities. And their use of language. So reformist reforms are generally unreflective about their use of language. They'll use terms like inmate, offender, parolee, and these are terms that legitimate the often unjust laws and circumstances that lead people to be labeled this way. The terms also imply that these are the most relevant characteristics of the people that they describe. Abolitionist work is conscious about using person-first language, so language that doesn't legitimate state categories, that or they consult the people being talked about as to what they actually prefer to be called. Abolitionist reforms also center the experience and expertise and leadership of people who are most impacted by the system. And this is in contrast to reformist reforms, which tend to use or are based on the work of quote unquote experts or professionals who have never lived in violent neighborhoods, been subject to police violence, or been under any form of correctional supervision. So basically people who have no experience of the system or the lives of the people within it, or what that's actually like. Abolitionist reforms are disconnected from sources of funding that come from the state. This can get a bit tricky sometimes with things like grant funding, just because of the basic fact that those with the most money don't generally want to change the social situation and power dynamics that allow them to have it. So any funding that's not grassroots can only go so far before it starts to get a little weird. They're also not punitive. They don't respond to harm by punishing, but by addressing unmet needs. And they seek solutions outside of the punishment system. They don't assume that the system is a broken one that needs fixing, but a properly functioning one that works to sustain inequality and racism and oppression, and that needs to be dismantled along with the society that made it. Next section here is, so in my activist work and my academic research, I've encountered some tensions and challenges in abolitionism. And as an academic, these are really some of my favorite things to think about. So this is the hard, uncomfortable questions, and I'm going to talk about a few of these now. The first one is about responses to harm and injustice. So a lot of the time when we see things like police murders, the knee-jerk reaction, even from within the social justice community, is to call for their indictment. And I call this the justice contradiction, because really practicing abolition requires a commitment to not doing this under any circumstances. It's a double standard to say that the system should be eliminated, and then to say that anybody should be subject to it regardless of what they've done. So a truly abolitionist conception of harm and violence requires understanding that locking up police or the Harvey Weinsteins or Bernie Madoffs of the world are not examples of justice, because we know that justice achieved through most of the traditional legal channels available exacerbates cycles of violence. This kind of response leaves the structural conditions and power relations that enable these kinds of acts unchanged. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we ready to apply the standard that all human beings are worthy of respect and a chance to heal to racist police, to war criminals, to perpetrators of heinous sexual harms? And an abolitionist perspective says that it challenges us to learn how to do this. It also requires putting the principles of accountability and transformative justice into practice in pretty intimate ways. And this includes when harm and violence are perpetrated by people within the movement, which does happen. As Miriam Kaba, who's one of my favorite abolitionist activists and scholars, points out, we have to acknowledge the reality that it is often hurt people who hurt people. So it involves being committed to and providing support for the person harmed and the person who perpetrated it, and dealing with them in ways that don't perpetuate cycles of violence. And if you're unfamiliar with transformative justice, that right there is essentially kind of the heart of it. And this is hard to do. No matter how much we resist, we're all indoctrinated on some level by carceral ideology to believe that harming someone who has harmed us is what justice means. I'm going to talk about another major challenge in abolitionism. And okay, every abolitionist has heard this question: what do we do with the rapists and the murderers? So the dangerous few is a term that's used to refer to the supposed segment of the population who pose too great a threat to society to not be restrained in some way. Just as an aside, my favorite response to this question that I ever heard was that we need to keep them out of office. In any case, a lot of abolitionists respond to this question by saying that the very concept of the dangerous few reflects a problematic understanding of violence. Miriam Kava, who I just mentioned, for instance, encourages us to keep in mind that who is considered dangerous or violent are the products of political decisions. Criminalization is the exercise of state power. She points out that people who cause inordinate amounts of harm by, for instance, dumping toxic waste or signing off on sending thousands of people to war aren't considered violent or dangerous people in the same way as when we talk about the dangerous few, even though these kinds of acts harm way more people than, say, somebody who commits a homicide. We can sort of picture this person who is asking this perennial question. It might be you asking this question. If so, that's fine. Now sort of maybe like blinking or staring blankly and responding something like, okay, but really what do we do with the dangerous people? The reality is that abolitionists don't all agree on the answer to this. Some say that for those very few people who are continuously harmful to others, temporary restraint is necessary. Others believe that the ultimate goal is a society that deals with all issues of harm and violence by healing and addressing needs, that through this we can create a society that doesn't produce that kind of behavior. But even still, there's the question of what do we do in the meantime? Do we create non-carceral means to temporarily remove people and handle them in non-punitive ways? And if so, what do these look like? And how are they different from imprisonment? These types of questions are still largely unresolved. The next topic I want to talk about here is about centering the leadership of impacted people. And for those of you who aren't quite familiar with that term, impacted people means people who are in prison, have been in prison, their families and relatives and friends and loved ones, and anybody who considers themselves adversely affected by the criminal punishment system. So this sort of philosophy is one of the most important things to a lot of abolitionists. So what happens when these folks take a position that others who maybe don't identify as system impacted in an organization tend to disagree with? Abolitionist movements and organizations usually have a radically progressive, socially conscious culture, one that does its best to defer to the voices and experiences of oppressed groups. We're sort of constantly on the lookout to avoid reproducing colonialist patriarchal practices. And there's a deep tension between this and the patriarchal, racist, heteronormative, machismo prison culture that people can get indoctrinated with in prison and that can follow them out after they leave. So what happens when incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people don't want abolition? These are issues that need to be addressed head on when they come up. Again, I don't have the answers today. I'm just raising the questions, but the good news is we don't have to have all the answers in order to keep pursuing these types of goals. We can build the ship at the same time as we sail in it. All right, last section that I'm going to talk about here is the idea of abolition as a project of personal transformation. And this is what I meant earlier when I talked about abolition as being a life path. Abolition isn't just a political perspective, it's a way of life. It requires a commitment to certain values. It's about radical social and structural change. And this requires a fundamental transformation in the ways that we relate to one another and to ourselves. It requires a commitment to values not only in activist work, but in one's personal life as well. An essential component of working toward an abolitionist future is individual self-work, a commitment to transformation and growth, and a willingness to engage in work on oneself and one's relationships that requires walking through fear and discomfort, requires facing and overcoming challenges in order to grow relationally, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Because this sort of personal and interpersonal work and healing is a building block for transformational work at the collective level. In her book, Emergent Strategy, Adrienne Maree Brown, who's a fantastic author, activist, I'm going to quote her quite a lot in the next few slides. She describes a sign she saw hanging on the wall of Grace Lee Boggs' home that said, "Building community is to the collective as spiritual practice is to the individual." And Patrisse Cullors, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, explains that abolition is about how we treat each other, about how we show up in relationships, about how we respond to harm caused, and how we respond when we cause harm. So if you believe that holding people accountable for harm caused is an important part of the path to resolving social harm and violence at its roots, you have to be willing to hold yourself and the people around you accountable and to be held accountable. It requires doing the hard work of forgiving people who have caused harm, including when that person is you. So what does this actually look like? There are a lot of different forms that this can take. Like, for instance, working actively to build structures of personal accountability into your own life, surrounding yourself with the kind of people and community who you can count on to hold you accountable, taking stock of how many of these kinds of relationships you have in your own life. And if you come up short, doing the work to change that by developing relationships, building connection, trust, being willing to be vulnerable and engage in fluid communication with the people around you. Our attitude towards other people is another part of this type of self-work, and it can involve cultivating compassion and empathy for others, even people who have committed heinous acts of harm. Working on not judging other people for example, calling the police, for calling someone out or for not calling them out, because essentially judgment ostracizes people who are judged just as much as it isolates those who do the judging, because it contributes to a culture of judgment that makes it hard for people to admit to doing things they're ashamed of and to asking for help when they need it. Also, being willing to ask ourselves why harm has happened when it happens. Usually the answer involves things like grief, abuse, trauma, mental illness, socialization, deprivation, loneliness. Asking why, because why makes it impossible to ignore that we might be capable of a similar transgression in similar circumstances. Now, I'm about to throw another quote up on here that's from an incredible book called Beyond Survival: Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement. Pat Davis, do you want to read this for us?
Sure. I'm looking on my phone. Let's see how good my eyes are. Why? Makes it impossible to ignore that we might be capable of a similar transgression in similar circumstances. Adrienne Maree Brown, Emergent Strategy. When we are able to admit that the capacity to harm lies within ourselves, within us all, we become capable of radically transforming the conversation around abuse and rape culture. We can go from simply reacting to abuse and punishing abusers to preventing abuse and healing our communities. Because the revolution starts at home, as they say. The revolution starts in your house, in your own relationships, in your bedroom. The revolution starts in your heart. Tom, Beyond Survival.
Beautiful, thank you so much. Another form that this self-work can take is about reconciling internal struggles and making space for contradictions. Working on changing binary thinking that tends to categorize people or their actions as simply good or bad, and understanding that we are all capable of harm and of good, and accepting that people are complex and full of contradictions, and making room for contradictory beliefs and emotions to coexist side by side. Okay, so trauma. Oppression is traumatizing. Even if you're not someone who's experienced trauma as the result of a particular event, there is healing that needs to take place simply as the result of living in a capitalist, settler colonial, ableist, white supremacist, heteropatriarchy that we live in. And everyone has healing and decolonization work to engage in. For some of us, it's about addressing the trauma caused by the fact that under oppressive social structures, we may have been targeted and denied our full humanity on top of any other kind of particular trauma. For others of us, it's about coming to terms with the fact that we benefit from unearned privilege at the expense of others. And it also requires acknowledging that there will always be some discrepancy between our actions and our values, because each of us is a work in progress. So giving grace to ourselves and to others, and recognizing that personal healing and liberation is a collective project. There is no personal liberation without collective liberation, and there's no collective liberation without personal liberation. It's essential to understand them as one and the same. We shouldn't and can't do all of this alone. So yes, individual work like therapy can be necessary and important, but the unit of personal healing is the collective. Individual healing has been depoliticized in our society, and that's an ideology that pulls people apart and perpetuates oppression in and of itself. Let's see. Ruth, would you like to read this for us?
I hope I'm the only Ruth on the call.
Yeah,
I'm not cutting
go for
someone
it.
else off. The work of cultivating personal resilience, healing from trauma, self-development, and transformation is actually a crucial way to expand what any collective body can be. We heal ourselves, and we heal in relationship. And from that place, simultaneously, we create more space for healed communities, healed movements, healed worlds. Again, from Adrienne Maree Brown, Emergent Strategy.
Thank you very much. So to borrow from this wonderful woman again, Adrienne Maree Brown talks about what she calls behaving science fictionally, And this I want to offer is another essential component of abolitionist work. This is about being concerned with the way our actions and beliefs now, today, will shape the future and tomorrow and the next generations. It's about imagining ourselves as the future ancestors that we are, taking care of our planet, but also, maintaining a certain degree of hope. We're responsible for that, for avoiding getting bogged down in despair or martyrdom. Things like frustration, anger, sadness, and despair are sometimes unavoidable in this kind of work, so it's important to hold space for them. People, a lot of the time, think and live activism as if it has to be an act of martyrdom, but the workaholism that promotes this is part of the capitalist ideology that a lot of us are working to fight against. I think it's important to remember that under capitalism, things like rest, play, and pleasure are revolutionary. And finally, repairing our relationships with our bodies. So the society that we live in does violence to our bodies and to our relationships with them in a lot of different ways. What this has to do with abolition, I think, is best embodied in a quote from Sonia Renee Taylor, who's a Black queer feminist who works on body acceptance and radical self-love. Margaret, would you like to read this for us?
Of course.
Thank you.
Our relationships with our bodies helps to create the world we live in. And we get to decide what is the world I want to create inside of me so that I can be intentional about the world I want to create outside of me. And making peace with our body is how we get there. When we don't do that, we replicate the systems that already exist. Because they're still in us, they're still the tools we're building from. We say we want a world that is equitable and just and compassionate, while we have inequitable, unjust, mean relationships with our own selves. It requires of us our work. It requires of us to cultivate inside of us that which we say we want to bring about in the world.
Thank you so much. So what I want to drive home with this is that, abolition isn't just about ideas. It's not just about a social analysis. It's really about us as individuals also. It's truly an all-encompassing perspective. That is all I have for you guys today, except for this last one. Another one from Adrienne Marie Brown says, "When I love myself, it's good for the world." I want to leave you guys with a few, some of my favorite resources for abolitionist information and also application. So some books, some authors, some toolkits put out by social justice organizations, some of my favorite podcasts, and a few academics. So with that, I am going to stop the screen share. And if anybody has any questions or wants to make any comments or anything like that, now is the time to go for it. I see there's some stuff in the chat. I didn't get a chance to see any of it since I was sharing my screen.
I'm assuming that all of the people who've created conversations or books about this have kind of like an outline, if that makes sense. Is there any sort of even just the briefest outline of like the steps to creating a new society?
There's a lot of different perspectives on that. One book that gets referred to a lot, I don't know if you guys can see this at all, it's called Instead of Prisons, Why Are So Many People We Love Behind Bars? A Handbook for Abolitionists, and it's actually from the 70s, but it gets referred to quite a bit. There's that, and then, and people please feel free to chime in on this because I know I'm not the only expert on abolition here. Collectively, a lot of the different disparate work of social justice organizations, really, if you put it together, each of these kind of has a plan for abolition on a really local scale. And so as far as what I've thought about it, I think one of the best ways to kind of picture how to create an abolitionist society is to start on that local level and sort of replicate that larger and larger. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. Thank you. It makes me think about how, you know, obviously this is simplifying it, but imagining there being like a blank slate where now it's, I'm wondering, it seems like if there were to be that blank slate, like there's so many collective ideas of what transformation and what a just world looks like how is it possible for a large group of people to decide on what would be best with this new start?
That's a really good question. And, you know, I don't think that there's going to be one answer to that by any means. My kind of, I like to defer to the people who, like I said a couple times in the presentation, are the most impacted by the system. And who have actually been through it. And so I think if there's going to be any type of like authority or leaders in this sense, those are the individuals who I think should be kind of bringing this forward and kind of articulating the vision and the strategy for what this should be and what it should look like.
I agree. I think that in addition to people who became punished, I think that you have to ask people who are victims within the system who also didn't get any semblance of health or justice or benefit from any part of the process. Even if someone is wronged, the wrongdoer gets punished, goes to jail, the victim isn't better.
Right.
And that almost never happens from my perspective, that there is any sort of justice for certain crimes against women, sexual crimes against women have very little justice. And what would that serve even if there was a higher rate of incarceration? I don't see that as helping anyone. I see that as actually causing more harm. So I think that you have to ask survivors, victims, and people who've committed crimes.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the reality is that they tend to be one and the same a lot of the time. And that's something that people tend to forget. There's a fantastic book by a woman named Danielle Sered. She runs I can't remember the name of her book, but she runs a program called Common Justice. And if you just look up any podcasts or interviews with her, she talks about this too, and how the system that we have now sort of prides itself on its supposed ability to redress victims, and how it doesn't ever actually do that because it doesn't address the root causes of crime, doesn't prevent things from happening again. But I'm glad that you brought that up. The notion of victims and survivors is super important too.
Well, I'm trying to figure out what you guys are doing, and the reason why I became interested in a lot of this is because I advocate for those with serious mental illnesses. I'm also on a crime survivors council. Okay, so I understand when you're talking about the social ideologies, excuse me, my dogs, and the different things, the different things going on in the world, as though, hang on, I'm gonna have to mute myself and come back.
I'm really excited to hear what Maree has to say.
Me too.
Marina, how common is electronic monitoring? I think that was what it was called. I've never heard of it before. Is it pretty common or not really?
I don't have like statistics, but I know it's starting to be used more and more. It's being touted as like this progressive alternative.
Do you mean cell phone tracking and that kind of thing, where police are tracking every single cell phone in, say, a downtown area?
No, I mean like with an ankle monitor.
Oh, okay, that kind. Okay. I think it's used sparingly. I know, like, I live in Oregon, and I think it's used when jail is actually not a good choice pre-trial often. I mean, I think that's probably the most common use of it, is actually someone that might not show up to court. I don't know.
That's definitely one thing that it's used for. Like I said, I don't have stats on it. I don't know if anybody else does, but
it seems like, again, that's something where instead of creating a new vision of just policing not existing, it's just contributing to there being more policing.
yeah, it's increasing surveillance, and it has an effect called net widening, which if for anybody who's not familiar with that term, let's see if I can explain this properly, where you create a punishment that's less severe, and so more people than would be originally get caught up in it, and then you just have like a larger pool of people who are ensnared in the system. And you know, once someone gets ensnared in the system in the first place, then it's more likely they're going to stay in it.
Okay, I'm back.
Great.
Oh, I'm sorry, I agree with the common ground I have with you is how inhumane a lot of the system is, and the prison industry in itself. Okay, I understand that. We have a law, our society has created a lot of laws and penal codes, okay? And that's assuming that people will follow them, right? And so what I'm picking up from you, and I understand all the transformation and getting to the point that everybody's so transcended that they would choose to be, you know, not causing harm and not doing things to others that would be destructive and dangerous. But I get all that, but that's assuming that there's no evil in this world. So my thought is, like, where are you guys just, when I would listen to the lecture, it seemed as though the majority of you think of the ideologies are social woes and they're not really spiritual. Like, do you not believe that this planet has evil in it, and that there is always going to be this, like, you can cure this, you know, you can cure evil, and you're assuming that everybody's going to want to choose to love and be good. And that's where you're losing me on a lot of this. So I'm interested in your comments on that. Thanks.
Well, the first thing I want to say is the stuff I said here, I don't want that to necessarily be representative of anybody else's views. This is just like my own kind of collection of work on abolition, and stuff that I've, you know, drawn from a few different sources. But, you know, it is definitely an ideal. And that's not to say that I don't believe that there are extremely problematic things going on in the world and circumstances that make it really easy for people to, you know, hurt other people and hurt themselves. I'm not trying to say that there's going to be this sort of perfect utopia and that's like the way that this is going to work. But we can create conditions in society that reduce the possibility and likelihood of these types of acts occurring in the first place. You know, the structure lends itself to increased violence and increased destruction. If anybody else wants to contribute to that, please do. I don't want to be the only one who's answering that question.
A quick comment on that one. Oh yeah, go ahead. You can go.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Just, and this isn't an answer, it's just a comment. It's like, not every person experiences remorse or guilt. So even just our current notion of like punishment or lack of punishment doesn't even apply to a person with that that experience in life, whether it's a mental health issue or personality disorder, or that will be their experience for life. So there's like a holistic change that has to happen to support a person who doesn't experience guilt and keep them from harming themselves or harming other people. And just like so much has to change for that. It's not just like buildings, it's not just courthouses and jails and mental facilities and housing and schools. Like even our society, like ourselves have to change, like Marina's slide. But yeah, it's just more of a comment than an answer, like a solution.
Eliza, were you gonna say something? I'll say something until maybe they chime back in. What your comment said, Maree, it totally makes sense to me too. And what it made me think was that, you know, there's evils in the world and they will likely continue, but our law enforcement and police system and criminal justice system isn't ending the evil now. If anything, it's almost creating more evil. So why stick with a system that isn't working if the goal is to prevent evil?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, my internet's being weird. That's kind of what I wanted to say. It's the people who I, like in recent years, have come out as like the most are evil, like Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, have current administration weren't dealt with by the system for years when they did most of their actions. So I would argue, similarly, I would argue the current system isn't addressing the truly terrible people of our society. If anything, it's reinforcing them because it's based on who has money, and to a certain extent, it's based on who has money. And the more money you have, the more harm you can do to a society. So I'd argue the current system. So yeah, I'd argue the current system isn't addressing evil, and we need an entirely new system to do something. I don't know what it would look like, but I'm here to learn. So, and yeah. If that makes sense.
It does.
Okay.
So this is not a direct addition to what's being talked about, but I'm kind of curious. Are there any countries or any good examples of who is doing this well? The thing I was saying about, I think what Ava or Ava, I apologize, was saying earlier, I think it's hard for people to, blank slates are hard for people. They need to have like examples. And that's why I think the reform is so much more popular than the abolition in my very preliminary learning, because it gives people something to start with. And so I'm just curious if you feel like there's anyone who's, again, maybe not doing it well, but who's making progress or who would be something to study.
I love that you asked that. That's such an important question. A couple people in the chat are mentioning the Nordic countries, and I think they're doing important stuff in terms of reform. However, you know, if I'm going to commit to ideals on this, which I mean, I like to do that. I think what I would say is that the societies that are doing this the best and have done this the best are really pre-colonial societies. Indigenous ones, for instance, maybe a few that still exist now, but primarily ones that existed before kind of Western civilization arose, and we kind of developed these ideas of, you know, patriarchy and punishment and power domination and things like that. I think that's where, and, you know, like I said, I just mentioned it briefly, but that's where a lot of these sort of like transformative and restorative justice notions come from, and like circle practices, like they're indigenous practices. But it's difficult to kind of just take those out of the society that they come from and try to drop them into a society with our values and our perspectives. Like it doesn't quite work. It can a little bit, but you know, and that's why I was talking about abolition as like a doorway to really understanding how, I mean, so personally, like when I first became interested in this, it didn't really occur to me that abolition was an option when I first started studying this stuff. I just knew that there were a lot of things about the punishment system that I thought were a huge problem, so I was a reformist. And then when I was introduced to the idea of abolition, and I was like, wow, I'm allowed? Okay, yeah, definitely. It was the idea of prison abolition. Once you start getting interested in that and looking into that and thinking about it, you start to realize how it's not just prisons that have to go for that to be something that lasts. It has to be the whole punishment system. And then you kind of think about that, and then you realize that it's not just the whole punishment system that needs to go. It's really like capitalism, because that sustains these structures. And then you sort of realize that it's not just capitalism that needs to go, it's the whole entire society that needs to go. Like one of the quote by Moten and Harney that I introduced more towards the beginning. So it's a huge multi-generational undertaking that may never happen, but I think it's something that's worth working toward anyway. For reasons beyond just things that have to do with social justice, but environmental justice and the health of the planet, and the perpetuation of humanity. Those are the questions that are at stake here.
Okay, thank you. I'm familiar with a lot of how the Nordic countries do it, but it seemed like that was more of a reform direction, because I do know that there are a lot of communities in the States that are now studying that and trying to use that as a model. But the reform versus the abolition kind of curriculum that you introduced is really a new way to look at it for me. So I'm trying to rethink all the ways that I've already framed my thought processes around it. So thank you.
I wanted to mention something again, because I'm agreeing with you on a lot of the, I'm whole food plant-based for a reason. I don't eat animals. I don't, any dairy or anything, just because of the whole animal industry. Okay, so then when I look at, so I understand, I can really empathize with all the things you're talking about, but humans need boundaries. And have you ever looked at the research? And I'm not talking about the whole system is working, but for those that have needed a boundary as far as changing their behavior, because people won't choose. They don't choose sometimes until they have a really good reason to change. That's well studied in, human behavior psychologists and things like that. In addiction especially, they know that they won't change unless they absolutely have to. They can be given many multiple chances, and then now what do you do when there's that, because it's the human behavior we're really talking about, and how you transform and change that. And it's a massive undertaking. I see it in all the layers you're talking about it, and I don't like using the legal system. Sorry, it's not a just system. I don't like using it for public health issues, for illnesses like mental illnesses. But I do know that some people don't change at all until they are contained to the point that they can then turn things around. They die. A lot of their bottom is death. So there isn't a lot of options. So have you looked at that, Marina, in how hardship sometimes, because you'll see people transforming within the certain systems when they hit, I don't like the word hit bottom, I don't like that, but you know what I mean, right? It happens with illness too. I'm a nurse, and a lot of people don't change their health behaviors or anything until they had a heart attack. It's that type of thinking is what I'm talking about.
And a lot of that has to do, there are so many different ways to answer this question, so many different angles, but a lot of what you're talking about, I think, has to do with the system that they get put into. When you're surrounded, when you're in an environment where you're completely dehumanized, it's really not conducive to the belief that one can change. There's a lot of kind of really sort of mainstream quantitative hardcore criminologists who subscribe to the adage that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And there's really no sort of principle that can put doubt on people's ability to change more than that. And I'm personally, I don't keep this a secret. I'm a recovering addict myself. And so, I understand how hard it is to make those changes, and I see people struggling to do it all the time, but I also see it happening. And it requires a difference in the circumstances that surround the person. And like I was saying, recognizing that it's not just an individual project. It's a societal project, but also it's a communal project. That this is something that, I personally believe that we need to engage in, not just on the level of one person at a time, but, understanding ourselves as inextricably linked to one another. I think that's a big part of it. But like I said, there's a lot of different ways to kind of get at the answer to that question.
Yeah, maybe if I could build on Mary's question. It's kind of in an indirect way, maybe. A lot of what I'm, and I really enjoyed the talk. It's really very useful, very interesting. A lot of what you say about, well, for example, about reformist versus non-reformist versions of reform, it sounds to me a lot like a kind of Marxian critique of liberalism, where, right, a Marxian critique of liberalism and really any non-communist form of socialism. You know, the idea that those are all half measures, and in a way, any kind of half measures prevent us from getting to where it is that we really want to go. So it seems very parallel to that. And, you know, if you think of the Marxian critiques, you know, they depend on underlying theories of social structures and underlying theories of human relations. And so, you know, I don't suppose you want your political program, you don't want a political program to necessarily be tied too closely to a set of underlying assumptions about human nature, about human society. But I do wonder to what extent, you know, to what extent people associated with the abolitionist project, I wondered, you know, to what extent have they really thought through the kind of underlying assumptions that are being, the underlying substantive assumptions that are being made about society. And, you know, I don't really want to talk about human nature. I don't want to necessarily bring in sort of essentialist assumptions, but you know, to what extent have people thought through these substantive assumptions, again, about social structures and about, I guess, human relationships, either in terms of psychology or, you know, if you want to get farther than that into the, you know, underlying, you know, metaphysics or whatever, but, you know, to what extent have people really thought through these underlying substantive assumptions?
I love that you asked that question, Mark. And of course you would, because you're a philosopher. I think those perspectives are so important. And to directly answer your question of, is this something that people who work on abolition have thought through? Not that I have found. To me, the most interesting and fruitful abolitionist work is being carried out on the ground, not in the ivory tower. And they're like, you know, I use this term in the talk where the idea is that people are really, they're building this ship as they're sailing in it. And it's a messy process that involves a lot of trial and error, a lot of people doing a lot of things that, I mean, there's, you know, there's sort of models and theories about things like alternative justice systems like restorative and transformative justice and how they work. But in terms of spelling out the actual assumptions about society and relationships and human nature, I have not seen that laid out anywhere. That's actually a really interesting project idea.
Or yeah, and that's fair enough. As you say, it's you know, insofar as one is working on concrete steps on the ground, that's one's emphasis. But you know, I think if you really want to push it farther, because there are, I'll just say one more thing, because one of the other things I noticed in the talk is that there is a kind of shifting between different vocabularies, but much of the conversation is put in terms of a kind of a therapeutic model. There's a lot of talk about healing individuals, healing society, healing oneself. And then I did notice that about the 48-minute mark, you also introduced the language of accountability, and which to my ear sounds a bit different. It sounds a bit Kantian in particular, but we won't get into that. But so, you know, so I wonder if you are going to have this kind of therapeutic model, then again, you need to carry out the important business of correcting the flaws in society as it exists. But again, if you're going to replace the carceral state and carceral ideology, it seems to me that at some point you do need to really think through the assumptions of what it means to say that, you know, one of the other questioners earlier asked about evil, right? You know, you really need to think through the questions about, you know, as I say, sort of the what fundamental assumptions are you making such that you can present an alternative to the criminal justice system in terms of a therapeutic model rather than a model that looks at, again, as you say at some point, returning harm for harm. So, you know, I look forward to that work, but you know, I recognize that that's probably asking for something that people aren't necessarily working on right now.
No, I agree that I think it is super important. And that's not to say that the work on the ground is just being carried out sort of like willy-nilly by people who have no idea what they're doing. Like, you know, there are some therapeutic models and psychological principles and theories that go into some of this. But in terms of the talk kind of tacking back and forth between different vocabularies, I mean, it's really on purpose. Like, I like to pull from a lot of different types of sources, both when I'm thinking through this material and when I'm talking to people about it. Because, I mean, there's this sort of perennial split between the macro and the micro level. And, you know, I don't like thinking in terms of that binary per se, but it's difficult to avoid when you're trying to talk about social analysis on one hand and then speak to people as individuals on the other. But I'm glad that you brought up those ideas. I think that's some super important work that I would like to undertake in the future for sure. I wanted to mention one more thing kind of in response to Christy's question that I sort of forgot to bring up about examples of this, of a successful abolitionist society, let's say. And one of my favorite sources to draw from, and this is sort of an area of this that I've just started and that I want to, that I have in mind to keep going with, is science fiction and visionary fiction as a source of ideas about how this might work. Because it's a different way of thinking. I think it helps break us out of the kind of linear perspective that a lot of us tend to have about progress or how this should work, or, you know, what steps to take in what order. And thinking about things creatively, I think, is really essential. And it also kind of goes hand in hand with some of the work that I think some of the most interesting community organizations are doing, where, you know, there's a lot of work to exercise the imagination, do things like moving the body, theater, dance, music, art, what have you, just ways of expression and of thinking through things without thinking, without using the intellect as a tool necessarily, because, I mean, there is a lot of concern about the occupation of psychological space by the carceral. And that's something that a lot of academics have written about that's really difficult to get around. And I think that thinking creatively is one way to deal with that.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right, cool. So I just want to go back and provide some comments of to some things that were previously said. So one of the things that Amy said was some people have no remorse, and I just want to challenge that idea. Is it actually that some people really have no remorse, or is there something behind it? Is there a deeper reason for that? If you think about it, our society works like we live in a punitive society where when people that causes harm, they are harmed, and the stakes of admitting that you have done harm, you have done something wrong, can be very high. And that is causing people to not admitting to have done wrong things. And we live in a society where when someone does harm, there is an incentive for that person to continue doing harm, so that there is no punishment done to that person themselves. So that's just an idea, and it's just me drawing from things I've learned from abolition and transformative justice. And I'll post a YouTube link that might kind of address this thoughts, and is definitely better articulated than what I just said. So that's that. And also, I also similarly, I want to challenge the idea of evil. What is it actually? What does it actually mean? What's behind it? And why do some people just keep doing bad things? And that's, well, I guess that's just an idea.
These are psychology questions. I'm not a psychologist. Briefly, I want to say I am an abolitionist. And I don't mean to say if someone doesn't have remorse or guilt, a judgment on that, but there are people who have lived their whole lives without experiencing those things. So our current system is useless to them, and it's useless to everyone, but even our ideas of how do you reform someone, or how does a person have a better life, are going to be different for people with different lifestyles and different experiences. And I'm coming from a place of sympathy for people who maybe do feel remorse but don't enact it or don't participate in it, whatever it is. There are personality disorders that just do not experience guilt. Their pleasure pain centers are different, and that's a medical thing, and maybe that can change too, which would be amazing. But yeah, I think we can't just have one thing for everyone.
I love what Michael said, because it kind of honed in on what Marina was saying during the presentation about like asking why. Like, why does someone have no remorse or experiences no remorse, and let's say it's related to a personality disorder? And it made me think about how a lot of personality disorders are shown or seen in people who may have experienced trauma, and how it's like, it makes me think about how trauma reduction and community healing, like again, with this being an example, would be helpful. Because like, if we had a very strong healing community, whatever that looks like, would we have less personality disorders? I don't know. But yeah, that's interesting. Or like the what is evil made me think of when Marina asked, it was something like why do people harm people, like all those questions. It makes it feel more like I could be the creator of this evil just as much as someone else could be. So thanks for your comment, Michael, and thanks for your comment, Amy, too, because I didn't really think of that either. So that was nice to hear both of your comments.
Just wanted to chime in that I think like hearing like this discussion, and it definitely is that abolition, and to that personal level, is that challenge of thinking out what is violence, what is evil, and what does that mean, and what does that look like, and where do we get that definition? Is it from an Abrahamic religion? Is it from an indigenous practice? Is it from capitalism? From what viewpoint are we looking at these things from? And even to think of like what country may be practicing abolition, we even think of countries and borders. And so the interesting thing that like I know that I try to do for myself is challenging all the different levels of where have I put these structures and where have I put these definitions. Where do they come from? Forgive myself for any trauma and abuse of where these things may have come from, and then look to see a new way to proceed. And then continuing to iterate on that, because of the fact that, we need community to be able to like practice these type of things. So for anybody who does have a social, psychological, mental health issue, illness, substance use, all these different components, if we have the community there to embrace each other, to be able to have the communication, to have the words, then maybe we can, work to start to bring down the violence. that is perpetuated by these structures and these systems that we have. And so, but it is definitely hard to have to look at all the things and be kind to yourself of the fact that it's okay. You were assigned a gender at birth, which is harmful. We all are in this capitalism and we're sent to different schools. And depending on what school you were sent on, could have faced multiple different traumas and abuses in that aspect. So in this, as Bell Hooks likes to say, this imperialist, patriotic, capitalist patriarchy, we are all, we are all culpable, and we're all, can work together to change the system.
I love that so much, Rose. I love all the ideas that you guys have just introduced, and I want to acknowledge the fact that it is 7:30, which is, I believe, the time that we said we were ending. So I want to just put that boundary there for anybody who needs to go right now. I'll probably go in just a little bit, but I just wanted to kind of wrap it up by saying I'm so appreciative of all the different types of feedback and comments and questions that you guys have brought here today. I think it's so important to think through all these things from the point of view of people who are immersed in this work and people who are not. People who, like Rose was saying, come at this from a lot of different ways of thinking about things, and it's really hard to interrogate all of those things, and like Rose was just saying, to like question all the different levels and background and acculturation and everything that we bring to this. And I do want to say that the commitment to the idea that everybody can change, I mean, a lot of people would see that as extreme. And it's not one that everyone who identifies as an abolitionist maintains, but it doesn't need to feel like an impossible thing to hold on to, based on exactly what Rose was talking about and what Michael brought up too. So thank you guys so much for all your comments and contributions, and